I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your methodology, not just in the book, but in the way that you have done oral histories with boarding school survivors and the care and the kind of spiritual kind of aspect of caretaking these particular stories.
I think I had an in because when I went to visit with them, I would go to their home. I wouldn't make them come out to an office. I would travel to South Dakota, Minnesota, Montana, North Dakota. I would travel to their homes where they were comfortable. Some of them weren't comfortable in their homes. We went to another room outside their home, or we went even to a restaurant at one time because they didn't want their family to hear the stories that they were telling. So I would offer tobacco, and I also brought gifts. None of that, of course, was funded by the university. They didn't know how to fund something like that, or they couldn't. But anyway, so I would offer gifts and tobacco, but I also would tell them that my parents were boarding school survivors. So I think that helped them become more comfortable with me and helped them to share their stories. So that's it. And then for their emotional help, I would ask them to seek out, if they weren't already in programs of recovery like AA or had sought therapy and grief therapy and PTSD, talk therapy, I would encourage them to do that. Since then, I had stopped interviewing when I interviewed a man from home, and he called me. He talked about sexual abuse, and he said, "I've never told anybody. I'm only telling you that he was sexually molested at Wapton boarding school." And he became suicidal, and that frightened me. And I happened to know the two psychologists, doctoral psychologists on the reservation, and I called one of them and I got him in within like 45 minutes. But I stopped interviewing for a couple of years after that because I am worried about the mental health. In Canada, I went up there and was an international observer for their truth-telling process up there. And there they had psychiatrists, psychologists, medicine people. They had a ceremony. They had paper bags that even the tissues of your tears were put in there and then put into the sacred fire. And even after they left for a week after, they kept mental health people in that community in case there's more triggers. So I have to be real careful if I continue to do more interviews to make sure that the people have follow-up health care and care after they tell their stories.
And just before we get started, are there any resources that you recommend people who are listening to check out?
Well, that's part of the problem. There aren't a whole lot of people trained that, psychiatrists, counselors, school counselors that are aware of boarding school trauma. So otherwise, Canada has some, they have a better information source, numbers and places to call where the United States doesn't. I think NABS, Boarding School Healing Coalition, might have a number up also. That may be a number to call. Otherwise, they need to seek talk therapy. There's just general therapy for PTSD. So many of them, like I mentioned earlier, said that they didn't want their names put in the book. You'll notice that in the book. And that's because they had to go through hearing themselves, the trauma that they went through, and they didn't want their kids or grandkids to know and have to have that burden on themselves. So many of them only told their husbands. And one man wouldn't be interviewed at all. He said, my boarding school stories will stay right here. And we know that we're off, the saying is we're only as healthy as our secrets. So I think there's so many boarding school people out there that I said in the book, this resounding silence of boarding school survivors. But then Gerald Visner was out to dinner with him a couple of years ago, and he said, where do boarding school survivors tell their stories? When do they tell their stories? Do we sit at Thanksgiving table and go, oh, I was raped by a priest, for 5 years when I was in boarding school. So that really struck me. So a lot of these people, they said, I've never told anybody. I don't know why I'm telling you. And I told them because I'm asking. So no one's ever sat down and asked, well, they have sat down and asked their parents and grandparents their boarding school stories, but many of them won't talk about it because it's still too traumatizing. So when relive their stories and tell their stories, they're going into trauma again. And it can put the listener into secondary trauma. So we have to be very careful when we're recording stories. But like the Holocaust survivors, many of them that went through the horrors of the camps are dying. And I believe, their stories all need to be told so that the world never forgets. So what my boarding school survivors said, please tell the world our story. So I think NABS is looking at a way to interview more people, or people can go onto their website and tell their story. I don't want the world to ever forget what happened to my parents and my grandparents.
Mm-hmm.